I had just turned 18 and was working a closing shift at a small cafe inside a grocery store. One of our regular customers was an older man named Tom. He was the kind of person who greeted us loudly whenever he came in, usually calling out something like, "Where are my girls?" before expecting all of us to hug him. During those hugs, he would hold on longer than necessary and whisper close to our ears. I had never liked being around him. One afternoon, I was working the closing shift alone when Tom came in around 4. His appearance wasn't unusual, and I had dealt with his behavior before, so I simply prepared his coffee and bagel. This time, he was accompanied by his wife, who seemed kind but looked exhausted. While I worked, Tom started asking me questions. He wanted to know what I did at night, whether closing alone was difficult, what time I finished work, and whether I was ever afraid walking to my car after dark. Each question made me more uncomfortable than the last. His wife remained mostly silent while he continued asking. I tried to answer politely because I didn't want to create an awkward situation with a regular customer, but I could feel the hair on the back of my neck standing up. I also noticed him watching me frequently while I worked. At the time, though, I wasn't overly concerned because I knew I would be finished at 7. The problem was that Tom didn't leave. His wife eventually went home without him, but Tom stayed inside the cafe for hours. He sat there watching me. Eventually, I asked him if there was anything else he needed. He simply told me that he was waiting for me to finish work. He said he wanted to walk me to my car because young women shouldn't be alone in a dark parking lot. I told him that wasn't necessary and continued working. After that, I mostly ignored him, even though I could still feel him watching me. About 15 minutes before my shift ended, he finally left. He walked out into the dark Michigan winter, and I remember feeling relieved. When I eventually punched out, I didn't think much more about him. I walked to my car, grabbed my snow brush, and started clearing the snow. The parking lot was quiet in the way snowy nights often are. Then I began hearing footsteps behind me. At first, I ignored them. I was in a parking lot, after all, and people walked around. But the footsteps kept getting closer. They passed the other parked cars and continued directly toward my vehicle, which was parked away from the others in the employee section. I looked up and saw Tom. He was standing about 50 feet away and smiling. He told me that I should have looked for him because he had been sitting outside waiting for me. He repeated that I should know how dangerous it was for a young woman to be alone in a parking lot at night. I started shaking. I tried opening my car door, but it was frozen shut from the earlier storm. Tom continued walking toward me, calling me a stupid girl and saying that he hoped God would forgive him. For a moment, I considered running back into the store. He was an elderly man, so part of me thought he probably couldn't keep up. But I didn't want to take that chance. I wasn't sure how old he really was, and I knew I wasn't particularly fast myself, so I stayed where I was. I reached into my purse and found my pepper spray, which thankfully was attached to my keys. I told him to stay back, warned him that I had pepper spray, and told him to go home to his wife. He stared angrily at me. I held up the small teal canister so he could see it. By then, we were only about 15 feet apart, well within its range. He insulted me, spat in my direction, and then turned around and went back inside the store. I got into my partially cleared car and drove home. I was terrified, even though nothing worse had happened. I called the store as soon as I got home. It was only about a mile and a half away, so the drive had taken roughly 2 minutes. I explained everything that had happened. The store banned Tom from returning, and when he became angry about it, his wife eventually had to come pick him up. A couple of years later, I heard that Tom had been arrested on child-related criminal charges. I had already moved away by then, so I never learned the details. I can't say I was sorry that I never had to see him again. This happened on a Danish highway that carried a lot of traffic. I was riding my motorcycle when I decided to pull into a rest stop. The place was very basic. There was only a parking lot and a toilet, with no gas station or other businesses nearby. Trees blocked the rest stop from view of the highway, making it feel much more isolated than it actually was. When I pulled in, there was only one other vehicle in the parking lot. A man was standing beside it. He came over to me, and almost immediately I thought there was something slightly unusual about him. He told me he was a German chemistry professor, although he didn't really look the way I expected a chemistry professor to look. He explained that he had been sleeping in the trunk of his station wagon, and, when he climbed out through the rear hatch, he had somehow left the keys inside and locked the car. He asked if he could borrow my phone to call for assistance. I agreed and handed it to him. After the call, I continued talking with him for a little while. He told me about the trip he was taking, while I was mostly trying to find a polite way to end the conversation. Then a battered van covered in graffiti pulled into the rest stop and stopped beside us. A man stepped out. There was something immediately strange about him. He looked like a combination of an old-fashioned gang member and someone involved with drugs. His first question was, "How much is that motorcycle worth?" I found that question unsettling. He continued talking about how nice my motorcycle was, and then started telling me about his life. He said he had worked as a West German truck driver during the 1980s, driving routes into East Germany. According to him, he had an East German girlfriend whom he would meet whenever he was there. Eventually, they were discovered by the Stasi, and he claimed he never saw her again. He believed she had been killed because of their relationship and because he was from West Germany. He then said he had moved to Norway and worked there as a butcher for 10 years. Then he casually added that some things had happened in his life and he had joined the Foreign Legion. The way he said it made me wonder whether those things involved serious criminal activity and whether joining the Legion had somehow allowed him to avoid the police or prison. I didn't know whether that was actually the case, but the story certainly made me more cautious around him. By this point, I was almost completely convinced that he was exaggerating or inventing parts of his story. What I couldn't figure out was what he wanted from us. Was he interested in stealing my motorcycle? Did he want my wallet or phone? Meanwhile, the professor clearly wanted to leave. Unfortunately, he was still locked out of his car. The strange man's conversation with me was partly in Danish and Norwegian, so the professor couldn't understand everything we were saying, but I think he understood enough to realize that the situation was making me uncomfortable. I decided to test the man a little. I asked him about something I had heard concerning the Foreign Legion. I told him I had heard that recruits were given a dog, made to care for it, and then eventually forced to kill and eat it. He immediately corrected me. "No," he said, "that's not true. It's a rabbit, not a dog." He then continued talking about the subject with such confidence and detail that I started wondering whether maybe some of what he had told us was actually true. Then he revealed something that made the whole story much harder to dismiss. He pulled up his sleeve and showed me a tattoo covering his entire arm from elbow to wrist. It depicted a French Foreign Legion soldier wearing his uniform. I remember thinking that it was a strange thing to have if he had simply invented the entire story. Even then, I still couldn't figure out what he wanted. He hadn't asked what the professor and I were waiting for, and he hadn't directly asked me for anything. Then a roadside assistance truck arrived to help the professor. As soon as the strange man realized what was happening, he became annoyed. He said that, if he had known someone was coming to help, he could have opened the car himself in seconds, because he had equipment for doing it in his own vehicle. The professor and the man became occupied with the locked car and the arrival of the roadside assistance driver. That was enough for me. I got back on my motorcycle and left. Looking back, I actually think the man may have been telling the truth about being a former legionnaire, a butcher, and a truck driver. He may simply have been a lonely person who wanted someone to talk to, but he no longer seemed particularly comfortable with normal conversation. He probably had plenty of interesting experiences to tell, but I would much rather have heard those stories somewhere less isolated than a quiet Danish rest stop.